Trump just went absolutely ballistic. The House Judiciary Committee has formally voted to refer impeachment articles to the full House, and in a response that has stunned even his closest advisors. The former president posted a series of messages that legal experts are calling potential incitement to violence. And this isn't some political posturing or campaign rhetoric. This is a sitting former president suggesting that his supporters prepare for what he called necessary action if Congress moves forward. Language so inflammatory that multiple governors have quietly activated National Guard units in anticipation of civil unrest. When state emergency management officials start mobilizing troops before an impeachment vote even reaches the House floor, you know something catastrophic is unfolding in real time. Hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss any of the videos I release. So what triggered this unprecedented escalation? A leaked committee report alleges that Trump personally coordinated efforts to overturn the 2020 election through a multi-state scheme involving fake electors, pressured state officials, and deliberate obstruction of the peaceful transfer of power. Sources who reviewed the 847-page document say the evidence includes recorded phone calls, encrypted messages between top advisors, and testimony from former White House staff describing direct presidential orders to submit fraudulent electoral certificates. This isn't just another congressional investigation or partisan witch hunt. We're watching elected officials from both parties conclude that the evidence of criminal conspiracy is so overwhelming that impeachment proceedings must move forward even though Trump is no longer in office. And believe me, when a committee votes 24-16 to advance impeachment articles with 3 Republicans breaking ranks to vote yes, you know something enormous has just detonated in Washington. Here's the full picture of what's been unfolding. Tensions in Washington have been building for months, fueled by the ongoing federal prosecutions, multiple state investigations, and mounting evidence emerging from the January 6th committee's archived materials. But everything escalated on January 14th when the House Judiciary Committee received a classified briefing from the Department of Justice regarding evidence that prosecutors say wasn't previously available to Congress. The briefing, which lasted nearly 7 hours according to sources familiar with the proceedings, presented what committee members described as irrefutable proof of a coordinated conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the executive branch. The report dated January 12th reportedly contains evidence that Trump personally approved the fake elector scheme in 7 battleground states, knowing that the electors had no legal authority and that submitting false certificates to Congress constituted federal crimes. This wasn't about legitimate legal challenges or exercising rights to contest election results. It was about deliberately submitting fraudulent documents to obstruct the constitutional process of counting electoral votes. Multiple sources say the evidence includes a December 2020 recording of Trump telling advisors that he didn't care whether the alternate electors were legitimate as long as they created enough chaos to delay certification. Smash that like button if this is making sense so far. Here's where it really gets serious. When members of the committee reviewed the full evidence package in a secure facility, even Trump's most loyal defenders couldn't find a way to explain away what they saw. Representative Jim Jordan, who has defended Trump through every previous investigation, reportedly sat in silence for over an hour after reviewing recorded conversations where Trump explicitly acknowledged that Biden had won the election, but insisted his team move forward with the fake elector strategy anyway. Sources in the room say the silence was deafening. And let's be honest for a moment. Impeachment referrals of a former president are virtually unprecedented. They don't happen over policy disagreements or partisan grudges. They happen when lawmakers conclude that someone fundamentally betrayed their constitutional oath in ways that threaten the republic itself. Here's what multiple sources say happened next. On January 14th, after the classified briefing concluded, the committee held an emergency session that stretched past midnight. The initial vote was expected to be largely symbolic, with all Republicans opposing and all Democrats supporting. But as the evidence presentation continued, something shifted. Representative Ken Buck of Colorado, a conservative Republican and former prosecutor, reportedly stood up and stated that his oath to the Constitution had to come before party loyalty. He announced he would vote to refer the articles to the full House. Within minutes, Representatives David Joyce of Ohio and John Katko of New York followed, both citing the overwhelming nature of the evidence. By the time the vote concluded at 1:47 a.m. on January 15th, the committee had voted 24-16 to advance 3 articles of impeachment, conspiracy to defraud the United States, obstruction of an official proceeding, incitement of insurrection. The articles claim that Trump violated his oath of office by orchestrating a criminal conspiracy to overturn a lawful election, obstructed Congress's constitutional duty to count electoral votes, and incited violence when the conspiracy failed. Drop a comment right now if you saw this coming. I read every single one. Now things get absolutely wild. Within 3 hours of the committee vote becoming public, Trump posted a series of messages on Truth Social that immediately triggered emergency consultations at the Department of Homeland Security and FBI headquarters. The posts, which remained live for approximately 90 minutes before being edited, contained language that national security experts say constitutes a clear call for his supporters to prepare for violent resistance. One post read, "The corrupt establishment has declared war on the American people. If Congress moves forward with this unconstitutional persecution, patriots must be ready to answer the call." This is 1776. Another stated, "Our National Guard should be protecting me and the Constitution, not standing with tyrants. If governors won't act, the people will." Law enforcement officials who spoke to reporters on condition of anonymity described the messages as the most explicit incitement to potential violence they've seen from a major political figure since January 6th. An FBI supervisory special agent assigned to domestic terrorism told CNN that the Bureau immediately elevated its threat assessment and began coordinating with state fusion centers to monitor potential mobilization by militia groups and other extremist organizations. The official stated that within hours, chatter on encrypted platforms associated with groups like the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys had exploded with discussions of traveling to Washington and state capitals. That's when it became clear this isn't just another political scandal. The bombshell moment came when governors in 6 states quietly issued emergency orders activating National Guard units for potential civil disturbance response. California Governor Gavin Newsom signed an executive order at 11 p.m. on January 15th, placing 500 National Guard troops on standby. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro followed with a similar order affecting 300 troops. By the morning of January 16th, sources confirmed that Michigan, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin had all issued activation orders, though none were publicly announced. Reporters who obtained copies of the confidential emergency management directives say the language is extraordinarily cautious, referring only to potential civil unrest related to federal proceedings. But officials familiar with the intelligence briefings that prompted the orders paint a much more alarming picture. They describe credible threats of armed protesters attempting to prevent the House from voting on impeachment, potential sieges of state capitals, and discussions among extremist groups about creating sufficient chaos to trigger federal intervention or martial law. This move sent shockwaves through both parties. When multiple governors simultaneously activate National Guard units in response to a former president's social media posts, it signals one thing. Law enforcement and state officials believe the threat of political violence is immediate and serious. The claims that this is merely political theater collapse when Republican governors in purple states are taking the same precautions as Democratic governors in blue states. This isn't the first time a president has faced impeachment while tensions with supporters reach dangerous levels. Think back to Richard Nixon in August 1974. As the impeachment articles gained momentum following the Supreme Court's order to release the White House tapes, Nixon's most fervent supporters called for resistance. But Nixon, facing certain conviction in the Senate, chose to resign rather than put the country through further turmoil. He gave a speech calling for healing and accepted the outcome peacefully. The nation moved forward. Then there was Bill Clinton during the Monica Lewinsky scandal. While Clinton was impeached by the House, he faced the proceedings through the legal system. His supporters were outraged. They organized protests. They accused Republicans of a partisan coup. But Clinton himself never suggested that the constitutional process was illegitimate or called on supporters to take extra-legal action. He participated in his Senate trial, was acquitted, and the republic continued functioning. The key difference: Clinton's alleged offenses, though serious from a personal conduct standpoint, didn't involve attempting to overturn an election or remain in power after losing. Subscribe immediately if you haven't yet. This content doesn't exist anywhere else. And let's not forget Trump's first impeachment over the Ukraine affair. Some Republicans privately expressed concern about conditioning military aid on political investigations, but publicly the party remained unified. There were no calls for violence, no suggestions that the constitutional process itself was tyranny, no governors activating troops. Even Trump's rhetoric, while combative, stayed within recognizable political bounds. He called it a hoax and attacked his opponents, but he didn't tell supporters to prepare for 1,776. Now, however, it's different. This time, Trump is explicitly framing the constitutional impeachment process as an act of war against the American people and suggesting that armed resistance may be justified. The pattern is clear. When presidents abuse power in ways that directly threaten democratic governance and then respond to accountability by inciting potential violence, the republic faces a test unlike routine political controversies. Political loyalty and partisan identity cannot hold when the alternative is potential civil conflict. So what allegedly triggered this unprecedented reaction? According to legal and national security experts who have reviewed the situation, Trump's response violates multiple federal laws while creating imminent danger of violence. Former federal prosecutor Glenn Kirshner told MSNBC that the Truth Social posts potentially constitute incitement under 18 U.S. Code Section 2101, which prohibits using interstate communications to incite riots or civil disorder. He explained that unlike the Brandenburg test applied to ordinary speech, statements by someone with Trump's following and demonstrated history of inspiring violence face heightened scrutiny. Juliette Kayyem, a Harvard Kennedy School professor and former assistant secretary at the Department of Homeland Security, told CNN that Trump's language represents a national security emergency. She noted that the specific invocation of 1,776 and references to the National Guard are coded signals well understood by militia movements and accelerationist groups who have been waiting for what they perceive as a call to action. She emphasized that these aren't abstract threats. Intelligence analysts are tracking concrete mobilization efforts in response to Trump's messages. Here's the kicker. The committee report reportedly includes evidence that Trump and his advisors specifically discussed using the threat of violence as leverage during the 2020 post-election period. Sources familiar with testimony from former White House Deputy Chief of Staff Tony Ornato say he described a December 18, 2020 Oval Office meeting where Trump stated that if legislators knew their constituents were willing to fight, they'd be more likely to go along with the fake Elector scheme. This wasn't spontaneous rhetoric. It was a deliberate strategy to use the threat of his supporters' violence as a political tool. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next. And here's what should alarm everyone. This isn't just about one impeachment or one set of articles. If a former president can openly call for potential insurrection in response to constitutional accountability mechanisms without facing immediate legal consequences, the entire framework of democratic governance becomes negotiable. Once the precedent is set that threatening violence is an acceptable response to legal proceedings, there's no turning back. Every future investigation, every prosecution, every accountability measure becomes a potential trigger for civil conflict. This puts Republican leadership in an absolutely impossible position. On one side, they face enormous pressure from a base that views any action against Trump as persecution and betrayal. That means defending his posts as legitimate political speech, attacking the impeachment as a witch hunt, and framing the entire situation as Democrats weaponizing government against their political enemies. It means dismissing the National Guard activations as overreactions and insisting that Trump's supporters are peaceful patriots being demonized. On the other side, they're being forced to reckon with a former president who just posted what national security officials describe as potential incitement to violence while governors activate troops. They now have to explain to law enforcement, to the military, to the American people why calling for 1,776 style resistance to constitutional processes should be treated as acceptable political discourse. That's a position that's nearly impossible to defend without abandoning basic commitments to rule of law. And here's the tricky part. There's no credible defense. Either Trump's posts constitute dangerous incitement that justifies National Guard activations and potential prosecution, or they don't, and this entire response is government overreach. But if it's overreach, That requires believing that multiple governors from both parties, dozens of law enforcement officials, and national security analysts are all fabricating or exaggerating the threat. The evidence of extremist mobilization in response to Trump's messages makes that explanation untenable. Legal and constitutional scholars are calling this a crisis that threatens the foundations of American democracy. Lawrence Tribe, a Harvard law professor and constitutional expert, told reporters that Trump's actions represent an attempt to hold the constitutional system hostage through threats of violence. He explained that the impeachment power is one of Congress's most fundamental tools for accountability, and if that power becomes unusable due to threats of insurrection, the separation of powers effectively collapses. While former presidents retain First Amendment protections, Tribe emphasized those protections don't extend to speech that incites imminent lawless action, particularly when the speaker has a demonstrated record of inspiring his followers to violence. Barbara McQuaid, a former U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan and current University of Michigan law professor, added that Trump's posts could violate multiple criminal statutes. She pointed to 18 U.S. Code Section 2383, which prohibits inciting rebellion or insurrection against the United States, noting that the maximum penalty is 10 years in prison and permanent disqualification from holding federal office. She emphasized that while prosecuting speech is challenging and rare, statements calling for potentially violent resistance to constitutional processes by someone with Trump's influence and history create exactly the scenario these laws were designed to address. Do me a favor and slam that like button because it genuinely helps this video reach more people. Even Judge Michael Luttig, a conservative legal icon and former Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals judge who has occasionally defended expansive views of executive power, stated in a Washington Post op-ed that Trump's rhetoric crosses a bright constitutional line. He wrote that no president or former president has the authority to delegitimize constitutional processes or summon citizens to resist them through force. He warned that if Trump faces no consequences for these statements, it establishes a precedent that future presidents can threaten violence whenever accountability looms, effectively placing themselves above the law. So let's break down what this could mean. First, the immediate political impact is staggering. The House is expected to vote on the impeachment articles within 10 days. If the vote succeeds, Trump would become the only president in American history to be impeached twice while in office and then impeached again after leaving office. While a Senate conviction is uncertain given the 2/3 requirement, the political symbolism is enormous. It signals that Congress views Trump's conduct as so egregious that extraordinary constitutional measures are warranted even years after he left the White House. Second, the National Guard activations create an unprecedented security environment. The last time troops were widely deployed in anticipation of domestic political proceedings was during the Civil Rights Movement and Vietnam War protests. Having military forces on standby for a congressional vote on impeachment is utterly unprecedented in modern American history. It transforms what should be a routine constitutional process into something resembling a national security emergency. Third, Trump's posts create enormous legal jeopardy that could trigger new criminal charges. The Justice Department is reportedly reviewing whether the statements violate federal incitement statutes or constitute obstruction of Congress. Legal experts note that unlike the January 6th speech where Trump used somewhat ambiguous language about fighting and being strong, these posts explicitly invoke violent rebellion and suggest that constitutional processes are acts of tyranny requiring resistance. That directness makes prosecution far more viable. Finally, looking ahead, the implications for American democracy are profound. Every Republican candidate will face questions about whether they condemn Trump's call for potential violence or stand with it. Campaign ads are already being produced featuring military veterans and law enforcement officials asking whether the Republican Party still supports constitutional governance or has fully embraced insurrectionist rhetoric. This creates a defining wedge issue that transcends typical partisan politics because support for peaceful constitutional processes has traditionally been the absolute baseline of American political participation. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'm genuinely curious to see your perspective. But beyond the immediate political and legal fallout, this is really about whether the United States can maintain constitutional governance when a major political figure rejects the legitimacy of accountability mechanisms. The impeachment power exists precisely to address officials who abuse their authority in ways that threaten the republic. It's not a partisan tool. It's a constitutional safeguard. If that safeguard becomes unusable because invoking it triggers threats of violence from the subject's supporters, the entire framework of checks and balances breaks down. The presidency becomes effectively unaccountable to anyone except the voters. And even electoral accountability becomes questionable when a defeated president can simply reject election results and call for resistance. This scenario has created absolute panic within Republican congressional leadership. Reports indicate that Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell held an emergency conference call on the evening of January 15th with senior Republican senators to discuss how to respond. According to sources on the call, McConnell argued forcefully that the party cannot condone or defend rhetoric that prompts governors to activate National Guard units. He reportedly stated that while many Republicans oppose impeachment on procedural or political grounds, Trump's response to it has made silence untenable. Other senators pushed back, arguing that criticizing Trump would enrage the base and trigger primary challenges. Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri reportedly argued that the posts were being misinterpreted and that Trump was simply expressing frustration with what he sees as political persecution. Senator Ted Cruz of Texas suggested that Republicans should focus on attacking the impeachment itself rather than addressing Trump's rhetoric. The call ended without consensus, leaving Republican senators to navigate the crisis individually. Meanwhile, Trump's core supporters are absolutely furious at any suggestion that his posts were inappropriate. Social media platforms are flooded with defenses claiming he has every right to call tyranny what it is and that patriots have a duty to resist unconstitutional persecution. To the base, Trump isn't threatening violence. He's warning that the American people won't tolerate their rights being trampled. They view the National Guard activations as proof that the establishment fears the people rising up to defend freedom. Some are openly calling for Republicans who criticize Trump to be primaried and driven from office as traitors to the movement. Things escalated further when the Department of Justice issued a rare public statement on the afternoon of January 16th. Attorney General Merrick Garland announced that the department is reviewing Trump's social media posts to determine whether they violate federal law and stated that anyone who incites violence in connection with congressional proceedings will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. While Garland didn't name Trump explicitly, the timing and context made clear the statement was directed at him. The Attorney General emphasized that the right to political speech is fundamental but doesn't extend to incitement of imminent lawless action, particularly when aimed at obstructing constitutional processes. Stay with me. What comes next will completely change how you view the situation. Here's what makes this even more extraordinary. Trump's response to the DOJ statement essentially confirmed that he intended his posts as a call to action. Instead of clarifying that he wasn't advocating violence or claiming his words were misunderstood, he doubled down. In a new Truth Social post, he wrote, "The corrupt DOJ threatens me for telling the truth about their tyranny. This is exactly what dictatorships do. Silence opposition, criminalize dissent. The founders gave us the Second Amendment for exactly this situation. When government becomes destructive of our rights, it is our duty to alter or abolish it. That's not incitement. That's the Declaration of Independence." Legal experts immediately identified multiple problems with this response. First, invoking the Second Amendment in the context of resisting impeachment proceedings is widely understood as suggesting armed resistance. Second, quoting the Declaration of Independence's language about altering or abolishing destructive government in response to constitutional accountability measures suggests that he views the impeachment as illegitimate tyranny justifying revolutionary action. Third, framing potential prosecution for incitement as persecution creates a circular logic where any legal consequences for threatening violence become proof that violence is justified. Former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe told CNN that Trump's follow-up post removes any ambiguity about intent. He explained that when someone accused of incitement responds by invoking the Second Amendment and revolutionary language, they're reinforcing rather than walking back the threat. He noted that this pattern mirrors how extremist leaders communicate with followers using coded language and historical references that signal violent action while maintaining thin deniability. This goes far beyond a single impeachment proceeding or one set of inflammatory posts. It's about whether the United States can survive as a constitutional republic when a former president with millions of devoted followers explicitly rejects the legitimacy of legal accountability and frames constitutional processes as tyranny requiring resistance. If there are no consequences for calling on supporters to prepare for 1,776 inches response to impeachment, every future accountability mechanism becomes vulnerable to the same threats. Prosecutors investigating corruption will face intimidation. Congressional oversight will be met with calls for insurrection. Elections themselves become optional when the loser can simply reject the results and summon followers to resist. If this blows your mind, hit that like button right now. Here's the situation. The House Judiciary Committee has voted 24-16 to refer articles of impeachment to the full House based on evidence of criminal conspiracy to overturn the 2020 election. In response, Donald Trump posted messages that national security officials describe as potential incitement to violence, prompting 6 governors to activate National Guard units and the Department of Justice to announce it's reviewing whether his statements violate federal law. 3 Republican House members broke with their party to support the impeachment referral, citing overwhelming evidence. Trump responded to potential prosecution by invoking the Second Amendment and revolutionary language from the Declaration of Independence. This is no longer just partisan politics or legal maneuvering. It's about whether calling for potential armed resistance to constitutional accountability is something America will tolerate from a former president. When governors are activating troops before Congress even votes, when the Attorney General is publicly warning about prosecution for incitement, when even some Republicans are breaking ranks over national security concerns, we've entered genuinely unprecedented and dangerous territory. If there are no consequences, it sets a precedent that destroys the possibility of holding powerful political figures accountable. Any investigation becomes persecution. Any prosecution becomes tyranny. Any constitutional process becomes optional when the subject commands enough loyal followers willing to threaten violence on his behalf. Keep a close eye on this story. The House vote on impeachment is expected between January 24th and January 26th. The Justice Department is conducting an expedited review of potential charges related to Trump's posts. National Guard units remain activated in 6 states. And law enforcement agencies across the country are monitoring extremist groups for signs of mobilization. More Republicans are reportedly reviewing the classified evidence and considering whether to support impeachment despite the threats from Trump's base. Military and law enforcement families are watching to see whether their elected representatives will prioritize constitutional governance over fear of political violence. Before we go any further, smash that subscribe button so you never miss content like this. Here's where things stand right now. 24 elected officials on the House Judiciary Committee just voted to advance impeachment articles documenting a criminal conspiracy to overturn an election. The former president responded by posting statements that prompted governors to activate National Guard troops and triggered a Department of Justice review for potential criminal prosecution. National security officials described the posts as the most explicit incitement they've seen since January 6th. 3 Republicans broke ranks to support impeachment, citing evidence too damning to ignore. Trump responded to warnings about prosecution by invoking revolutionary violence. This isn't just another political controversy that will fade with the next news cycle. This is a constitutional crisis unfolding in real time with troops on standby, prosecutors reviewing charges, and a former president explicitly framing accountability as tyranny, requiring resistance. What happens in the next 10 days could determine whether the United States can maintain constitutional governance when a major political figure commands followers willing to threaten violence on his behalf. The evidence is documented in an 847-page committee report. The impeachment referral has been made with bipartisan support. The National Guard has been activated. The Attorney General has issued a warning. Trump has responded by doubling down. Now we wait to see if the House has the courage to vote, if the Justice Department will prosecute, if governors will maintain security, and if the American people will demand that constitutional processes be allowed to function without threats of violence. The stakes have never been higher. The threat to democratic governance has never been more explicit, and the moment of decision has never been more immediate. Pause for a second and hit that like button if you're finding value in this coverage.